Jeff Bezos, when he bought the Washington Post,
Yeah.
set down an editorial order saying, hey, look, Washington Post is going to be the paper of free markets and the paper of free exchange of ideas. But like, these are the principles. These are certain ideological
Uh,
principles that our work
Partially
fits
free
within.
exchange of
Yeah,
some ideas.
exactly. Offer not valid in Gaza.
Hello, and welcome back to Always at War, the only podcast I'm familiar with that attempts to answer the question, why is the United States always at war? I'm Courtney Rawlings, here as always with Alex Jordan, and today we're going to talk about the media's, inability to hold certain countries responsible for what some would call, or should call, war crimes. Alex, how you doing?
Courtney, I'm doing okay. How are you doing today?
Fine. I have a beautiful view. Why am I so bad at answering that question?
Well, you want to be honest, and you're like, I'm disturbed by the world, but I'm also trucking on.
Yeah, like to be fair, I just researched this episode, and
Yeah.
that doesn't do much for your hope and
No.
having a good outlook on the world.
No.
Doesn't do a lot. So,
Yeah.
but
It's
like in general, I'm
depressing.
happy to be here with you.
There you go. There
Always
you
love
go.
seeing you. Always love being able to hang out with you.
Agree. Agree.
Wish I was in LA, so but I'm in Seattle. That's fine. It's fine.
It's sunny here in LA, but still as depressing as the world is outside down here as it is up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, depressing. Let's dive right in.
Mm.
That's what we're here for. That's what you come to this show for, is to learn about this sorry state of the world and if there's any hope of improving it. And there's some.
Yeah. Yeah. I,
Projecting hope.
no, that's you can't really like work in this line of work unless you have some hope. Otherwise, you just become like those, beltway. Are you allowed to say ghouls?
Sure.
Maybe. I'm going to say
Yeah.
it. Who obviously have given up hope.
If you know propaganda for what it is, you are protected from its lies. Not only that, you can take measures against it by giving the lie to the enemy at every turn.
We've been talking about this episode for a while, and then a few days ago, it was actually earlier today. That's how insane the headline mess is. But we saw this headline, and it kind of struck up conversation between the two of us, and I was like, let's bring this to the pod. So, Alex, I sent you a document. Can you read the first headline on that document and the date?
Ooh, okay. July 23rd, 2025. News analysis in the New York Times. Shootings, devastation, hunger, Israel fails to address Gaza's power vacuum.
Okay. So, upon first glance, you may not see an issue with that headline, but even if you just read the small description of the article underneath, it begs the question of, is the New York Times giving us a helpful descriptive headline? Because as the follow-up reads, over the weekend, Israeli soldiers shot Palestinians near an Israeli-backed aid site and a UN convoy. Both episodes pointed to Israel's refusal to allow new government structures to emerge. So if I was going to rewrite that headline, it would not be Israel fails to address Gaza's power vacuum, which makes it sound like Gaza is doing something wrong, right? It certainly sounds, or Gazans or Palestinians are doing something wrong. It sounds a lot like that's who's to blame, when just in the first paragraph, or the little description under the headline, it's very clear this is about shootings perpetrated by the IDF. It is
Right.
and happening at a Israeli-backed aid sites.
Well,
Um,
so I think you're onto something with the fails to address, because so it names these sort of like floating occurrences: shootings,
right.
devastation, hunger. These are things that are happening, but there's no causal relationship or responsibility assigned. Israel is being said it's failing to address Gaza's power vacuum, which makes it sound like Israel is reactive to the problem being identified. What the headline doesn't do is say Israel is creating these problems.
Yeah.
It's saying
What do you
Israel is
mean Gaza's
trying to,
power vacuum?
yeah, Israel is really failing to react to these problems that have emerged from who knows where. Who's doing the shootings? Who's causing the starving? Oh, I don't know. Like, read more. But as we know, in this current era of not terribly high like media engagement and literacy in America, people are often not reading beyond the headlines. And a summary of a story should hypothetically be a summary of the events and what's needed to be known from the person who is just reading that headline. And if you read that, like you said, it sounds like there's no real obvious responsibility in those words for who is
Yeah, like there just
creating.
happens to be shootings, devastated, and hunger. Israel should be doing something about something. It probably has to do with the shootings, devastated, and hunger, but it's unclear who. And it's like, well, no, Israel's is like a better headline would be like Israel has shot over 1,000 aid seekers at its own aid sites in the last few weeks. Um, I am calming down
No,
because
there's no reason to calm down. This rightly is filling me with fury as well as you're feeling. Like, it just is. It's so upsetting. I mean, you know, years now into the most recent spat of Israel like bombing Gaza, to have this just complete unwillingness to tell a very straightforward story. Because I mean, I think that's part of what we're getting at in this larger sort of conversation about media critique when it comes to the war in Gaza, which very credibly has been characterized as a genocide by many international legal scholars. Um,
including in the pages of the New York Times. Although today, of course, they ran Bret Stephens' delightful op-ed that read, "No, it's not a bleep that. It's it's not a genocide." I mean,
right. It's not a
I just
genocide
can't
because
imagine.
Israel has not been methodical and destructive enough in having killed all of these people already.
I
It is a
simply
ghoulish
cannot
argument.
imagine running that article at a
Yeah.
time where
Yeah.
there are reporters at the New York Times who are closely following what's happening in Gaza. I hope they're not the ones responsible for these headlines. That's typically editorial. But, they're following this closely, and then they allow people like Bret Stephens to come out and say things that blatantly go against their own reporting.
Right.
I mean,
And
I simply need a therapy session here, Alex. I don't understand how that's possible.
Well, let me give you one of the things that they would say in response, that the Times PR people would say in response, and I'll let you decide if this is any or if this is any consolation.
It won't
So
be, but you may
yeah, it
proceed.
won't be. Because spoiler alert. But so the Times would say,
Mm.
first off, there's a firewall between editorial and reporting. That what the
Yep.
editorial staff chooses for its headlines, and that's just for like op-eds and columnists. That is totally separate from what reporters on the news side say. But I think it's pretty fair to say, between how the op-ed section, a lot of the prominent voices there talk about the war in Gaza, and how news articles and news analysis and straightforward reporting, the headlines that those stories are given, show a very similar shared bias when it comes to telling the story of what is happening in Gaza. Again, like, it is a very clear and simple story. Israel shoots, Palestinians at aid sites. Israel devastates these communities in Gaza and razes these buildings. Israel starves Palestinians who can't get aid, and Israel controls the aid points, the checkpoints, and won't let sufficient amount of aid in. But the active voice is just completely missing from this news headline. So you wouldn't know at first glance that this is a story that isn't terribly complicated. It's about Israel, using U.S. weapons to commit a genocide and using U.S. diplomatic support to defend it on the international stage, and working with, in the case of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, U.S.-backed charities to,
Yeah.
lure Palestinians into these killing fields where they're killed seeking aid. Like you mentioned, it's like some 700 plus people have been killed at these GHF sites that are run by a U.S.-backed charity, and then like hundreds more at UN aid sites.
I meant to send this to you. There was a NPR piece today that put that number around 1,000. So that's why I said 1,000 earlier.
Well, yeah, it is. It is between UN sites and GHF. It is 1,000 now. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just didn't want to sound like I didn't know that we didn't have a number, but um, I I guess like what is most disturbing is that, as you and I already know, but as I want to kind of talk about, and I don't want to just pick on the New York Times, like other people do this, but the New York Times is the paper of record. And so if you scroll down, Alex, you'll see I have several other New York Times headlines, and we can kind of decide which ones we want to talk about. But so we have this first one: shootings, devastation, hunger. Israel fails to address Gaza's power vacuum. Just endlessly misleading. This is another New York Times headline: plan to indefinitely displace Palestinians threatens to derail Gaza truce. And the subheadline: an Israeli proposal. Okay, right? In the subheadline, they do all the work the headline should do. An Israeli proposal to force much of Gaza's population into a small enclave is now overshadowing negotiations over a truce. So those are just from the last 2 weeks. There is a treasure trove, or what's the opposite of treasure? A demonic trove
disgusting trove
of these headlines that we could
slop bucket.
I mean, we can go back decades, and see these kinds of headlines that, to my eye, consciously and purposefully lie or just fail to hold Israel and its citizens responsible for the atrocities happening on the ground in Gaza, and that have been happening for a very long time.
Well, and I think, look, there's there's this straight up claim about like what journalism should be and like what a good headline should be and what it should do. It should inform the person who reads it. Not necessarily everybody's reading the story. It's important to create like a causal relationship when people are getting killed, to not just sort of throw up your hands and saying it's happening. The plan to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. Whose plan? Keep reading. Like it's irresponsible. But I think more fundamentally, like I think that there would be less of an issue. We would take less an issue. People in general would take less of an issue if this was, if they were writing crappy headlines, but then being very clear and straightforward in how they report these stories, being very intentional in ascribing blame to Israel throughout this war, and like the very obvious war crimes, and the statements of Israeli leaders saying we're about to go do these war crimes, watch us. Like it would be less of a problem if the New York Times like told that story very straightforwardly. Instead, the story of the New York Times coverage during this war in Gaza has been, and not entirely, but there are a lot of very like obvious and egregious examples of this, taking Israel at its word over and over again, despite like endless obfuscation, endless lies from this government about its conduct in the war. And just to take this example, the shootings at the aid sites, the New York Times is among the many outlets that after these first shootings, when the aid sites were going up, after these first shootings had taken place, Israel said, we didn't have anything to do with that. That was actually a bunch. Hamas infiltrated the sites and started the shootings. And all the media turned around and said, well, we have all these like civilians and like some journalists on site who are saying Israel are doing these shootings, but on the other hand, the Israel government denies it. So, it's who's to say, really, when it's like we are doing that sort of reporting, the both sides reporting of this after, and not putting your thumb down as like a responsible journalist of like, this is a government that's lost all of its credibility. when it comes to telling a story about what's happening in this war. Like, to not have that be the first instinct and instead balance coverage as if the Israeli government's claims about this war should be weighed heavily against like on the ground reporters and civilians who have told these stories over and over again about this is happening to us, this is being done by the Israelis against the Palestinians. And the Western media says, oh, it's hard to say, Israel strongly denies this, and then they won't.
Right, but I hate to interrupt you, Alex, though I'm doing it. I guess like I don't think it's purely an issue of the New York Times taking Israel at their word. I think that's partially to blame. But when you read these full articles, I mean, the reporters are not, missing the facts. They know that there has been, dozens of shootings of Palestinians by the IDF. Even Israel is kind of admitting this. So I don't understand how that gets lost in the headline. Why is it that despite the reporting, the headlines, allied holding Israel responsible?
I think a part of it is like the headlines generate like outrage. Like there's like a lot of backlash when the New York Times does describe something accurately. Like I think there was a time, particularly early in the war, where like Israel government and pro-Israel accounts were like incredibly vicious and hostile towards any news that took a straightforward approach to the war. So I think, as always with Israel, like there is some amount of sort of internalized speech policing that people sort of self-apply to themselves, or maybe it reflects, the headline editors, genuine biases, or, I think you could point to any number of potential reasons, but we know the outcome of bad reporting that obfuscates responsibility, Israel's responsibility to this genocide. We know the effect is that it creates uncertainty, and it fails to inform people of the realities of what U.S. military aid is being used for. But I don't know. What do you think that? Because like, it's hard to say like, oh, it's one thing. It could be 100 things, but
yeah, I guess like I just look at different outlets like, I don't know, Middle East Eye, or even The Guardian. And while they all fail at some point or another to accurately convey the reporting in the headline, for the most part, they've done a pretty good job at holding Israel responsible for what are very clearly war crimes, increasingly crimes against humanity. I think these are very well documented. But for some reason, the United States paper of record is incapable of doing the same. So much so that, right, like I mentioned, they ran an op-ed today that denies that there is a genocide going on in Gaza, not for the reasons you might think, not because it doesn't, accurately reflect the definition, right? It's because simply if the Israel wanted to, this is his argument, by the way. Fred Stevens' argument is, had Israel wanted to commit Jewish genocide, they would have done it already. And that, I mean, there's really just no responding to something like that. It is in the long shadow of history going to look very poorly on, obviously, Bret Stephens, but also on the New York Times for running something so against the facts on the ground, against their own reporters' understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I think you point at something important here, which is there is a lot of evidence and a lot of credible accusations of like intent to commit and obvious committing of war crimes. And, Israel is touting this plan to like definitionally ethnically cleanse the land, like get rid of Palestinian people. They're also committing these widespread murders and bombing campaigns committing all these crimes that like very well, they're organizing the malnutrition and starving of Palestinians, all these things that fit under the rubric of genocide very obviously. And so if you are in charge of a very influential, arguably the most influential news organization in the US, at some point, I can't tell you when that point should have been. I can't point to you on the calendar. I've got some ideas, but like at some point you have a responsibility to put your foot down and be like, oh, okay, I see the world that I live in and what's in front of me, and we have to have an editorial line that like very clearly treats this as like, you know, the historic crime that it is, and the historic crime that it like our government is like largely supportive of and complicit in. And so the answer for why the headlines are more accurate is because nobody in whatever the leadership structure is saying, hey, like you know, this is what's obviously happening, and our reporting and editorial comment needs to reflect as such. I mean, we know this can happen. Jeff Bezos, when he bought the Washington Post, set down an editorial order saying, hey, look, you know, Washington Post is going to be the paper of free markets and the paper of free exchange of ideas, but like these are the principles. These are certain ideological principles that
partially
our work fits
free
within.
Exchange of some ideas.
Exactly. Yeah, offer not valid in Gaza, like that. But like we know that people are capable of doing that. It's the same with the Politico's owner Axel Springer has said to hand down some editorial lines on Gaza.
You can tell.
So. Yeah, so I you know,
I think that's
yeah.
probably right. It's unfortunately like it comes down to a bureaucracy that cannot believe its own reporting. And I think, I mean, this would be like my most generous take, is afraid of the administration in some way. You know, not necessarily Trump's. Biden's was horrible on Gaza policy. I just mean the United States administration writ large. They have made it very clear that no matter what Israel does to Palestinians, America will continue to blindly support Israel. And so when that is your administration's very clear, almost, line, then these papers tend to fall in line, less risk their reputation.
And I think you're right to say, like, both Biden and Trump engaged in like a real discouraging and like chilling of pro-Palestinian speech generally, and like honest accounts of the genocide in Gaza. And both of those administrations like waved away claims of genocide. Obviously, Trump has gone a bit further. Like,
I would say like the Gaza protests, like, you know, deporting and expelling some of the major figures in the Gaza protests. I mean, that has had a majorly chilling effect on how people, on free speech, on people's ability to talk openly about Israel's war crimes.
Sure, like the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, like just, you know, there's the arrest of I believe it was a Tufts University graduate student who had written like an op-ed.
Professors have been fired. I mean, it's really...
and there's this the recent sanctions against the UN special reporter for human rights in Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese. Like, you know, they sanctioned her. They've said, you know, any funds related to her that travel through a U.S., you know, person or a U.S. institution's account, you have a responsibility to like block her funding. So they're like debanking her from the like global financial system. And that's meant like, you know, she's protected. Her work is protected under various international like laws and statutes. Like UN.
Like that's her job, by the way, is to make sure that her, you know, her voices like her own are protected by.
Well, and like conventions that we're signed onto about like sort of the obligations people have to treat special reporters as having like wide latitude to investigate, you know, crimes or whatever's within their jurisdiction. But yeah, so we're sanctioning her and saying this is what happens when you like speak out on Palestine, and when you point to U.S. companies that are complicit in the genocide, that like you are going to have a much worse life. And like that's a message. If a UN special rapporteur is not protected from like retaliation from the U.S. government, then like, you know, what
it's always the free speech people who come back around and go, not that though.
Free speech.
It's like literally every time.
It is also possible for newspapers and other forms of communication to be controlled by private interests.
I thought I told you to kill that story. It'll cost us a lot of advertising.
If that story goes out, I quit.
All right.
So before we wrap up really quick, Alex, I just wanted to shout out Asal Rod, who does really great work, especially on Twitter. And I mean that genuinely. Like, she is doing the work on Twitter. What she does often is she goes back to headlines and edits them for clarity and to say what the article actually says. So I actually pulled from the archives this post from Asal from March 7th, 2021. Do you want to read the headline and then I'll read her fixed? We'll also put it on the screen, but you want to read the headline and then I'll read her, I don't know, edits?
Sure. Yeah. So the original headline, evictions in Jerusalem become focus of Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right. This is what Asal rewrote it as. Forced expulsions in Jerusalem become focus of Palestinian struggle. I think that this kind of intervention into headlines and headline writing by, a real expert, someone who has been following this closely for a very long time, are so helpful and clarifying just how guilty the media has been in eclipsing or erasing Israeli involvement. Sorry, not involvement. Israel's blatant perpetration of these war crimes and before the war, just crimes against the Palestinians.
Yeah, I like the idea of counter programming.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like it's like the best case scenario for social media use. It's like like building a platform, like telling the story that's beneath the headlines, because there's obviously a lot left out there.
Yeah, and if you don't follow her, I really highly recommend it, only because I think even if you're in the line of work where you read the news every day, or if you're just a close follower of what's going on internationally, you may not even realize how this kind of headline reporting or this kind of quote unquote balanced reporting is balanced purposefully in order to elide who's responsible for said crimes. So balance becomes a code word for cover up. I don't know, or treating someone with soft gloves. When is that the phrase? I just forgot. Has soft gloves? Soft.
White, white glove treatment. What is it?
Soft touch?
Kid gloves.
Kid gloves. Kid gloves. Treating someone with kid gloves when, we're talking about a country, a very wealthy country, that can definitely handle it and should be held responsible for what they're doing. So I really applaud her. I think, she is in the mines every single day, putting stuff out and correcting the headlines. And I would definitely hit follow.
In the content lines.
Yeah, she's in the content mines. That's where I live and breathe as well. But
we're getting posters long down here.
Yeah, posters long. Episode title.
A community rates low on an information scale when the press, radio, and other channels of communication are controlled by only a few people, and when citizens have to accept what they're told.
Thank you guys so much for listening, for joining us. Please rate and review. We are a very new podcast, and I cannot kind of stress how much we need you to kind of just take the 2 seconds it takes to rate and review the podcast. You can listen to us anywhere you listen to podcasts. Of course, hopefully you're watching us right now on YouTube, on Quincy's YouTube page, but you can listen to us wherever. And be sure to follow, subscribe, like, and share with a friend.
Hell yeah. Thanks, folks.
Peace.
Peace.
Well, now you've seen a fair sample of enemy propaganda. Leaflets, magazines, broadcasts, posters, street demonstrations, rumors, agitation.